And welcome everybody to the Sapien podcast. We have another amazing episode, and I am so thrilled to share with you Dr. Christopher Davis. Dr. Davis is a cardiologist by trade and has really been a pioneer in transitioning out of the sick care model and focusing on sort of preventative care and health optimization. Someone who is very like minded with me. All my listeners know where I stand with all this sick care stuff. And he's got a relationship with Liquivida, which is an amazing organization out in the Florida area, focusing on IV therapy, hormone balance, and functional medicine, and really what I consider lifestyle medicine. And sort of avoiding the pitfalls of the Western medical system. So I think this will be a really fun conversation. Dr. Davis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm excited about our conversation. So, yeah, let's get started. I'm excited to be here.
So I had a great episode with your partner, Sam Tejeda. He and I really got into it, and any of you listeners, definitely check out that episode. That was super fun, and I feel like we could have talked for the next 5 hours. I think we cut it off at like an hour and a half because, well, for obvious reasons. But we have such a like-minded approach to healthcare. Maybe you could share with your listeners a little bit of your story anyway, and how you found yourself doing the work that you do now.
Yeah, sure. Well, I started out after years and years of training. By training, I'm an interventional cardiologist, which means that after medical school, I did an internal medicine residency and then went on, stayed on to do a chief medicine residency. So that was 4 years more of my life. And then went on the cardiology fellowship with a research focus as well, which is 4 years, and then stayed for an additional 1 year for interventional cardiology. So
Wow.
suffice it to say, by the time I was finished, I was what, 13 years in after college training. And I was super excited about being a cardiologist, an interventional cardiologist. I'm kind of a instant gratification type of guy, meaning that, putting somebody's having a heart attack and I could run into the hospital and put a stent in and save their life. That was rewarding. Um, but after 10 years of practicing that type of medicine, I started to realize also that putting that stent in was kind of the band-aid fix of a much bigger problem. And what the system had not taught me was really how to avoid the pitfalls of that kind of putting the band-aid on, as opposed to kind of treating underlying root causes of this person having the heart attack in the first place. And so I really felt ill prepared for that. And I thought that, my medications and taking the cholesterol medications, that was the answer. But shortly, when I got into practice, I realized that wasn't the answer. And it wasn't just heart disease, it was many other diseases. And so that was kind of my first kind of inkling. And as I started to see, I wasn't really happy with the outcomes and what was really happening. And I started to kind of do some reading, and I read a book called Undoctored,
Mm.
which was probably the pivotal turning point of my career. I read this book by William Davis called Undoctored, and the full title is, I think, Undoctored: How to Become Smarter Than Your Doctor. And he told all these stories about our broken healthcare system and it being more of a sick care system. And as I started to read the book, he was a cardiologist as well, and he would tell stories about going into the hospital and putting stents in. And I'm thinking to myself, man, that's exactly what we do. Yeah, put a stent in, and they'll come back 6 months later or 9 months later. So everything he said really resonated with me. I mean, I was like, whoa, okay, this guy is really speaking the truth. And so that's when I really started to think, okay, I need to really get into the true health. How do I help my patients truly be healthy? How do I get into healthcare as opposed to sick care? And I had to really find my way. And so that's kind of what all started it. And then, I got involved with my first brush with kind of this wellness medicine or a lifestyle medicine, or my first kind of uh, things into functional medicine was Liquivida, right? IV nutrient therapy. I knew nothing about IVs. I mean, what is IV nutrient therapy? But with my cardiology practice, I started an IV nutrient lounge in the back of my building. I started IV nutrient lounge, and that really opened my eyes to really get me to start to see that we could truly get people better by doing other things. And so from that point, it was just more reading, more education. And within a year, I was sick and tired of this system and said, hey, I'm done. I'm going to figure this out. and created a system outside of our insurance driven kind of cattle call medicine, I like to say, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then from that point, it wasn't easy making that transition. And I probably made it a different way than most people would. I literally said, hey, I'm done with this. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'll figure it out. I
Mm-hmm.
shut my doors and I said, I'm not taking insurance anymore. I'll figure this out. So the first year and a half, 2 years was rough
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't, what does figuring it out mean, right? I didn't know what figuring it out meant. Like, what do I need to do? How am I going to do this? But, after about 2 years and kind of starting with just nutrition, really it started with just nutrition programs and seeing just the effect of telling people to, eat whole foods, get rid of the processed foods, stay away from gluten. And all of a sudden, my blood pressure is better. I lose weight. My headaches are gone. My rashes are gone. And me just seeing that, I knew that there was more to what I should be teaching people. A lot of stuff that we weren't taught in medical school. So,
What an inspirational story. You probably said this a million times, and I do too, but it takes a lot of courage especially after your training. I got really disillusioned just after my 3 years of internal medicine residency. I grew a strong passion for end of life care, and that was actually my first taste of where we're lacking in Western medicine. I felt it was so it was missing, the emotional support, the spiritual support, the love, the kindness, uh, in end of life care. And that's actually, I only say this in retrospect. It's funny.
hmm
At that
hmm
time, I was just frustrated. I was just like
hmm
this young guy, frustrated, and sort of started my practice, and then also read a book called The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz.
hmm
And that was my big pivot. After I read that, I couldn't recommend what I used to recommend. It was a wrap, and I had the same thing. I left the hospital upset, in a huff, and just started practicing what I thought was good medicine, and developed, a nutrition program, which, we all talk, it's what you described, exactly the words you used. Is just I just named it the Sapien diet and lifestyle. It was just
hmm
a fun thing me and my friend Brian Sanders came up with, and it kind of ran from there. And I live on sort of both ends of the healthcare spectrum: preventative care, trying to help people not be sick chronically, and then end of life care, trying to help people transition with dignity, with support, with a component of spirituality, which is
Yeah.
so missing. And so I really hear you, and I commend you so much for. See, I only had 3 years of residency and I was out. To
Yeah.
do what I know what you did, and maybe listeners, you guys don't understand. Dr. Davis gave his life for this Western medical system. And yes, you saved many lives, but you couldn't actually get to that root cause problem that we all seek when you really get serious about your health. And I think that's the message. And just I commend you for the courage after all those years to just
Yeah.
step away and be like, hey, I'm gonna do
Yeah.
something different.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. I really, when we talk about, yeah, I saved lives by putting stents in and people having heart attacks, but I can tell you right now, I save more lives every day doing what I'm doing now than I saved putting stents in, hands down, no question asked about it. I think the other thing that I really commend you on, and I will say that it's not just in the life care that we need to spend more time with the spirituality and emotional component, because most chronic illness is driven by emotional components, trapped emotions, emotional things that we don't typically deal with as physicians. And truth be told, we don't have time to deal with it in the traditional system, right? But most of my clients, I mean, I do a lot of advanced stuff, a lot of advanced testing and genetics and micronutrients and environmental toxin testing and all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, I can do all that advanced testing. But it still may be this emotional component that really is keeping that person sick. And I don't know that many people understand and buy into that concept, but it's 100% real. And so I incorporate really a more holistic program with my patients, and even get other practitioners involved that do things like the emotion code counseling and other modalities that allow these patients to release those trapped emotions, and then they really start to get better. So it's not just the end of life care. We as physicians, one thing that we've been missing, and the whole, we talk about the doctor patient relationship and really establishing that bond. Well, with 5 to 7 minutes in a room, that doesn't happen, and it will never happen. And so the beauty of practicing the way we practice, the way I practice right now, and likely the way you practice right now, is we can establish those bonds. We can establish that connection. And that's the power of being a good physician.
Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit about your practice. And so are you a do you consider yourself a concierge medicine physician, or are you just doing like sort of
Yeah.
coaching?
Mhm.
Because just a little background, like I have this fantasy that I can figure out how to provide this kind of holistic care through the insurance model. And I talk about this on my podcast a lot. It's very challenging. It is not financially viable. I've struggling, and I continue to struggle, and I probably have an endpoint, to be honest with you. I even tell my patients this. I'm like, look at what I'm doing. I'm here for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and I have a PA helping me so that I'm not staring at a computer the whole time. And I have an awesome support staff that I pay very well so that they're there and emotionally present for my patients. And so my business model at Evolve Healthcare is not a lucrative one or really a financial viable one. So I always want to know, how is it that you're able to provide this kind of care? Uh,
Yeah. So that's a very, very good question. And so I'll take that in kind of phases here. My practice now, we can call it a concierge practice. I don't like to use the word concierge because concierge doctors, there are lots of concierge doctors now. And basically all it is a little more access to the physician. You pay a fee for that access. But the care you're getting most of the time is still the same type of care, not getting to the root cause. So I hesitate to say it's concierge, and my practice, if you people talk about it, they will call it a concierge simply because they pay cash.
mhm.
I don't like to call myself that because I am so much different. My practice is so much different than every other concierge practice that particularly I'm in Sarasota. Particularly in Sarasota, I don't know of anybody else that kind of has a model that I have. It's more functional medicine, lifestyle medicine. I call it transformational medicine.
Mm.
Um, and so what I've done, it is concierge, and the concierge fees are fairly, like, I'll just kind of tell you numbers. I mean, people can, yeah, I'm just being transparent because one thing you'll get from me is transparency.
Love it.
I started out and I was scared to charge anything. I was like, I think I might have started at $1,800 a year or something like that. And then shortly after, within maybe a year or two, I was at 3,000, and then we went to 4,000, and then I went to 6,000, and now I'm at 9,000 for basic stuff, and I even have some people that up in 20,000. So it really took and so along that way, though, what happened was I had to recreate myself. I was a great cardiologist, but I didn't know functional medicine like that. I didn't know all the things that I knew. So over the last 6 years, one of the things that's super exciting about getting into a model like this is I realized that my passion is learning. My passion is really the drive that I have to continue to learn and to get out there and figure out what's new in the space, was what drives me. And so I just continue to learn and continue to just do different things, continue to offer services that nobody else can offer. Nobody else is offering. And Sam knows some of the things we're working on now. It's absolutely incredible. So and in that growth, what happened was patients just started to come because they couldn't get it anywhere else. And so yeah, my model now is, people, and it's so I can do it because, they're paying anywhere from $9,000 to $20,000 a year. But there's a problem in that. There's a problem in that because you can only affect those people who can afford you.
Mhm.
And that has been a major problem for me. And so now it's about how do we scale this thing? How do we give the education to everybody who needs it, right? It's most of the people who need it are the people who can't afford it. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how we can even do group sessions, how we can have health coaches. Even in my practice right now, the number of calls that we turn away because they can't afford it, it's problematic for me. Like, I look at the SEO numbers, we look at the calls, we tracking what's coming in, and if you can't afford it, we're turning it away. Why are we turning that away? So for me right now, it's about creating a system also that we can actually take care of me. I don't care if you can afford $500 or $3,000 or whatever. Have a system that we can take care of everybody. And so your goal of having an insurance-based model, something that insurance will pay for, that we can deliver this type of care. That's the same goal I have. It's a monumental task. I don't know how we get there, but it's like people like you and me and whoever else hears this and other physicians that are listening. we pull the power of all of our minds together to try to do this. I mean, that's the only way to do it. And so a lot of these podcasts that I do, I do it because I want, if a physician's listening to it, I want them to understand the passion that I have, that you have. And hey, some of us went to medical school for a reason, and we not just want to be part of a system and be a cog in a wheel, right? And so the doctors who want to hear that, they're going to say, well, wait a minute, let me figure this out. And we just kind of all have to really start to work together to try to hopefully get to a point where we can deliver the care that we as physicians went to medical school for.
And to add to that, it's, people hear these numbers and it might be shocking, but see, I know what you're offering, and it's not just your time. It's not just your cell phone number or whatever, right? It's biometric testing. It's lab work that is so interesting and extensive and provides so much knowledge about a person's individual health goals, risks, et cetera. Like, there's so much great technology in the space, and insurance companies don't want to pay for it. That's what I find so shocking. It's like we have some really interesting, like I'll just use an example, food sensitivity testing, right? And they just won't cover it. And you're like, but, if I do this one test and I can tell you, what foods to avoid. Sometimes they're shocking, like for a patient, what to avoid. I know you do a lot of toxin work and looking at what's been building up in a person's bloodstream and in their cells, doing micronutrient testing where we're looking at the cells, opening up the cells and looking at what's in there and what do we need to really supplement? What do we really need to change? And those kind of amazing technologies are not covered by insurances, which is insane. That's the insane part that people should realize. It's not that they couldn't cover it. It's not that they just underpay us for our time. It's that they're resistant to any sort of movement towards a model that will limit their pharmaceutical prescription, their expensive procedures. They complain about the hospitals getting overflowed, but they don't do anything to keep patients out of the hospital. They don't do anything to keep patients from getting that second and third stent, especially when they're motivated after that first stent. It's just, here's your antiplatelet therapy, here's your blood thinner, here's your cholesterol drug. Ooh, we got a new cholesterol drug. This one's really expensive. Pay for that. And it's like, sure, there's a role for that. It's not about poo-pooing the Western medical system. Right. It's just that there's so much more, and the boundaries to providing those tests are so limited. I mean, they're so great that like the boundaries are overwhelming. And so, yeah, we have to come on podcast and talk about it so we don't sound crazy. At least that's why I do it, because it's, to some people, it sounds crazy. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's crazy that they sell you pills and promise you the world, when if you just look at the basic data on this stuff, it's silly. It's not impressive. And drug company reps come to my office and I challenge them on their absolute versus relative risk reductions. And I challenge them on their exclusion criteria. And they're always shocked because like, what? Why are you asking me this question, doctor? I'm like, what do you mean? I'm a scientist. This is basic. We went to medical school. We got trained on sensitivities and specificities and number needed to treat and all of these interesting components of research. I didn't forget them. Like, I remember that. You can't trick me.
Absolutely. I mean, that's, the whole numbers needed to treat. And when people are telling that this statin reduces the risk of heart attack by 35%, when indeed, when we look at the real numbers, most statins decrease your risk, particularly with primary prevention, 1%, 1.2%, most of the studies show. So for, a 1% reduction in you having a recurrent event or having a heart attack versus 35%, what we are thinking the numbers are, it's a big difference, right? So absolutely. And most people don't know that. But again, it's for podcasts like this, it's for talks that we give. It's all about educating the end consumers, about educating people about what they truly need to be doing to be healthy, educating people about what tests they should ask their doctor for. Now, whether it's covered or not, is a whole different story. As a cardiologist, it's insane to me right now. It's insane to me to look at a normal or regular lipid panel that just tells me my cholesterol and my LDL, HDL, and my triglyceride. In my opinion, okay, if I'm going to my doctor, and it's a shame that cardiologists even are just looking at a regular lipid panel. what's the true benefit of looking, what's the real risk assessment and looking at just a standard lipid profile? I can tell you hands down that it's very, very little data that's coming out of it that's going to be helping you. Meaning, in one of my talks that I give, I have a guy who has a cholesterol of 170. But of that 170, the small LDL particles are extremely high. The lipoprotein little a is extremely high. The inflammatory markers are extremely high. Genetics wise, he's something called an ApoE44, which is extremely high risk. So all of a sudden, that low risk patient becomes much higher risk when I look at the advanced lipid panel, right? And so what do? We take the next steps. And what happens? He has 70 to 80% stenosis in 3 of his arteries. But when we put him in our little risk calculators that we all go by, he comes out as low risk. That's a problem, right? So, it's about educating patients about things like that. And that's just one example.
Well, it's an important example. I think, especially hearing it from a cardiologist. I think sometimes as an internist, primary care doctor, they don't believe me when I talk about the cardio IQ test, the fractionated lipid breakdown, the LP little a, the apolipoprotein B. I mean, those are so interesting. More and more people are at least aware of like a coronary artery calcium score, which is
Yeah.
always an interesting test where we do a CT scan looking for calcifications in the heart. Um, like, if my listeners are pretty savvy with this stuff. My question to you is, so what interventions have you started using for this? I think I came to this podcast with a focus on nutrition. So I really talk about, limiting processed food, of course, low carbohydrates. I promote an animal-based diet. I promote intermittent fasting as a really great strategy to control your diet and to, promote autophagy. And so, what are the kind of interventions that you're working with? I know some, really high level cardiologists that do what you do, and they're still really into pharmaceuticals, especially the newer injectable ones,
Mhm.
because they can modify that ApoB status. I'm curious where you stand on that because I think it's a really common battle. Can you control it all with nutrition and lifestyle? Is there still a role for pharmaceuticals, if you're in that high risk category?
So let's go back to your comment on the calcium score. I want to talk about that a little bit because even the calcium score has really evolved. And in my practice, I actually, on most patients, unless it's a contraindication, I get a coronary CT angiogram with an AI-based platform on top of that called Clearly. And so Clearly allows us to look at plaque, the plaque, what the plaque is actually made of. So Clearly allows us, and the patients love it because basically we get a 3D reconstruction of the heart, and I have my big TV screens, and I'm kind of showing them what the heart looks like, and then we're just scrolling through their arteries to look at plaque composition. So, are they calcified plaques? Are they non-calcified plaques, or are they these low density plaques, or which are really the high risk plaques that have more a more predisposition to form clots? They kind of, I like to call it, like when I see it on the scans, that's the sticky plaque. And so your platelets and red blood cells are more likely to form a clot there and actually have a heart attack. And so I think the thing that's important about Clearly, and I've seen this quite a few times now, and the reason I do that on most clients now, particularly if the lab suggests they're higher risk, is because calcium score itself will miss disease. People can have non-calcified plaque, and the calcium score is 1, 2, 3, 0. And then when we do the Clearly test, I had a lady just last week, it had a 70% LAD, the artery on the front of the heart, and one of the major arteries, 70% LAD stenosis. That's all non-calcified plaque. So, and I suspected it based on her labs, right? High LP little a, high lipoprotein phospholipase A2, which is an inflammatory marker, high CRP, high small dense LDL. That wasn't the biomarkers were not low risk, right? So I knew that, okay, we got to be looking at other things. And so it turns out she had significant disease. I mean, to your question about, well, what do we do? What are my interventions? So a few things. It depends on what the underlying. We talk about looking at underlying root cause. I'm kind of going on my thing now. My thing these days are toxins, right? And
Mm.
I'll probably talk to you about it. And when I say my thing, I mean it's amazing what we've missed the forest for the trees. We're kind of in the biohacking world, kind of health and wellness, longevity industry as well. And I say this, and I say it in all sincerity. The best biohack that we have today is to improve mitochondrial function by getting rid of most of the toxins that we're exposed to. Heavy metals, plastics, herbicides, pesticides, those things are, I mean, they are wreaking havoc, causing more oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction. And if you start to measure those things, you will see them over and over and over and over and over again. And I'm using some very unique testing out of Germany where we can measure mitochondrial function, measure mitochondrial oxidative stress levels. We measure mitochondrial function, membrane potential. And what you see is if you can improve those toxins, you improve the oxidative stress levels measured by 8-OHDG or measured by MDA, malondialdehyde, and we improve mitochondrial function. I know this is real scientific, so you can tell me to dumb it down.
No, this is beautiful.
Um,
Keep going.
but we can improve the oxidative stress and mitochondrial function simply by getting rid of all the toxins that we're exposed to. And so I've really dove in over the last year in the toxin world because it's not just heart disease. It's every neurocognitive disease. It's Parkinson's, it's Alzheimer's, it's ALS, it's autoimmune disease, it's cancer. And when you can start to show these things, I mean, the whole, like my practice and what I'm doing right now, and I think that's why I get all kinds of patients these days, because I can focus in on these things and kind of show you where the problems are. And more importantly, we can also be very proactive and preventative. If you see these things early, we can address them before you get the illness. Some of the things that I do right now, I got cases where I can backtrack into, for example, I have a guy who has ALS. He had formaldehyde that was bound to a gene. That's called a DNA adduct or epigenetics. How do we change gene expression? I can't change what your mom and dad gave you, but I can change the way that gene is expressed by epigenetics. And that's things like lifestyle. That's things like the toxins in our environment. Well, we found formaldehyde bound to a gene locus that coded for a glutamate receptor. And we know glutamate has a lot to do. That same glutamate receptor was what has to do with ALS. That's one case. I could go on with case after case, things like this. So these environmental toxins are why we get sick and why we get old, period.
You really are speaking my language, Doc. I get it why Sam had to have us talk. I have so much to learn from you. I come from the same school of thought. Because I do so many different things, I think my brain is a little bit diluted, and I haven't been able to dive into all of these new tests and all of these. But absolutely, it comes down to mitochondrial health.
Yep.
You know, I have this product Cellular Energy, which is a very simple sort of multivitamin with components like NAC and L-carnitine and even resveratrol, and that are thought to really help with mitochondrial support. And sounds like you're familiar with some of them, but I mean, definitely not to the extent that you're testing, and I'm not able to give my patients that kind of feedback. But I already know that we live in a bizarre world full of just garbage. We're constantly exposed to toxins. We have drugs that are toxic. Our food system is toxic. Everything that, especially if you live in a big, I used to say that, especially if you live in a big city. And now there's this great research paper. Well, great. It's a sad paper looking at, the rates of Parkinson's disease in the rural population, and they're like astronomical. They're skyrocketing. And it's as we're using more and more toxins for planting, and then you get into this whole nutrition discussion of like, oh, well, if, you got to eat more plants. And I'm like, yeah, but in order to grow these plants, you're covering them in so much herbicide and so much toxicity. You're actually killing the farmers and everyone who lives around the farmers and giving them neurological disorders. And we're ignoring that because it's not convenient to talk about. And it's super sad because it used to be if you were in these rural places, you were sort of protected from the city and all of that. And man, it's so sad to think about how much we're destroying our planet. The soil is so unhealthy that, I even have people that eat a healthy diet and they're low in B vitamins and magnesium. And one of the things I've become quite interested in is sulfur deficiency because, our soil used to contain sulfur. It's part of every biological process in our body, and we're not getting it, and we're not getting collagen anymore because people don't eat that part of the animal. It's so many layers to this thing, but certainly toxicity is, probably at the heart of it. And and I'll say one more thing to that. it's not just the environmental toxins, the physical toxins. It's the toxicity of like social media and the
Right.
toxicity of media. They're pumping us full of such bizarre information. You know,
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
I you know, tell you one thing, then it gets disproven. They don't talk about how they were wrong. They just move on, and then people are super confused about, well, why aren't we talking about that anymore? And I'm over here obsessed with it, reading all these papers, following these interesting scientists that talk about it, and then they don't want to hear it because they've already moved on to the next media cycle about some other garbage that they don't even care about, but they're sad about because they're told to be sad about it. And that toxicity leads to this emotional distress, which you were describing earlier, that then makes your mitochondria work worse and
Yep.
everything starts breaking down. And then everyone's wondering why they're depressed, anxious, can't sleep, can't get a good workout in. And, they're coming after us for trying to give people IV therapy. Like,
Right.
what's going on, man?
There's a big disconnect, my friend. There's a big disconnect. I mean, honestly, I always use the analogy of the stress bucket, and what you're talking about is all the toxins that we're exposed to. And in that stress bucket, when we can have chemical stress, physical stress, but we also that emotional stress, everything makes up that stress bucket. And we all have a different size bucket, and that's what we call resiliency, right? The stress resilience.
Mm.
And if you don't have much resilience, then my stress bucket is smaller. But at the end of the day, chronic illness raises its ugly head once the stress bucket starts to overflow. So my goal with all of my clients, which I talked about the emotional component, my goal with all of my clients is to start to empty out the stress bucket, right? I got to empty out the stress bucket, whether it's emotional stress or these environmental toxins. But the other goal also is how do I increase the size of my stress bucket? How do I improve stress resilience? And that's where all the things like breath work and meditation and all the other ways to increase the size of my stress bucket or my stress resilience. So I use that analogy with all my clients so they can understand I'm sick because my stress bucket is overflowing. For example, people will ask me about exercise. I'm an exercise enthusiast, right? But if your stress bucket's overflowing and you're mold toxic, and I'm not going to tell you to go out and try to exercise yourself to death, because at the end of the day, all of a sudden that exercise, which we typically call a eustress, is causing you distress because your stress bucket is already overflowing. So I say, no, just take it easy. You can go out and walk right now and just walk. But until we get the stress bucket emptied out, I don't want you to do that because it can be problematic. So we use a lot of biometrics. You talked about measuring things like biometrics, but heart rate variability is fantastic. How do I measure my stress bucket? Heart rate variability, right? And so I use a heart rate variability to let me know when my patients are ready to start to do more.
Is that a device? How do you measure that?
So lots of different things. We can use Aura Ring. I'm a big believer
Yeah.
in the Aura Ring. Some of the watches, obviously, and then there are lots of devices that measure heart rate variability. But my favorite is just kind of overnight HRV with an Aura Ring. It's just simple. I don't like to sleep with watches on and stuff like that. So most of my clients will have an Aura Ring, and we look at those numbers and you can tell when your autonomic nervous system is unbalanced. Right, that's what heart rate variability is. It's a measure of your sympathetic tone and parasympathetic tone and the balance thereof. If they're not balanced and you're more sympathetically driven, the fight or flight, the world's about to end, right? Your heart rate variability is super low. When the heart rate variability is higher, you're kind of more in balance. Okay, that's the balance of that sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So you can use it once you start to kind of dial into knowing what those numbers mean. Like I can tell when I'm getting sick or something's going to happen because my heart rate variability starts to go down, or if I drink wine or too much alcohol or something like that, the heart rate variability goes down. Didn't get enough sleep, my heart rate variability goes down. If I'm about to get a cold or some other, my heart rate variability goes down. If I'm overstressed, my heart rate variability goes down. So it's just kind of knowing those type of things that helps you kind of dial in on the patients as well.
So interesting. You guys are really leveraging the technology to know what's going on. I use such basic things like I'm pretty obsessed with the triglyceride HDL ratio paired with
Mhm.
fasting insulin, paired with CRP, and then I do so that's like in the basic blood work.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
because again I've just used the tools that insurance will pay for.
Pay for it.
Yeah, and then I'm really big on getting sleep studies, those home sleep studies.
Mhm.
I have a dentist that I do sleep restoration with because so many people don't realize they have sleep apnea, or
Mhm.
even just a mild form of sleep apnea can really affect your body's ability to operate at an optimal level. And So we try to do those tests as often as patients will willing to pay for it. Another one of these things, like it's not that expensive, but they got to pay a couple $100 to get the device, do it overnight, get a sleep doctor to read it for us and get us a nice report. And then, I try to guide with supplementation, and we use oral appliances.
Yep.
That
Yep.
my buddy Dr. Gabe Adorjan, who I did a podcast with about sleep, he builds
Mhm.
them. He's got a 3D printer and a 3D scanner, and like does these custom made oral appliances. It
Yep.
helps a lot of people. It's like a
Yeah. Yeah.
really simple intervention.
Yeah, I use a lot of the same thing. And as a cardiologist, one of the main issues that comes out of untreated sleep apnea are cardiovascular issues, right? Coronary disease, heart failure, arrhythmias. These are all things, pulmonary hypertension. These are all things that result from untreated sleep apnea, and most people have no clue. I'm a big believer, like you said, in the dental work. I bet your friend probably learned from Dr. Guy Yatros, who's right here in Sarasota, is who I send all my patients to for the dental device. But 100% agree with you on that. I mean, I try to get people who say, "Oh, I can never use sleep apnea device. I tried it and I can't." The dental device has been very, very helpful for that group of people. The overnight sleep studies that we can do at home now have gotten much better. 5 years ago, there was some devices and they were kind of sketchy, but I think even the home devices now really have provided enough information that we can make reliable decisions on.
Yeah, the tech is really, really helping us. We're all over the place, which I knew we would be because I think in our brain, like as you're talking about it, I'm following every line and I'm like, yes, and this connects and that connects. But, maybe someone listening is like, man, these guys are all over the place. It's because we are all over the place. We're trying to tackle so many things this is what I consider primary care, what we're talking. This is actually primary care. Dosing amlodipine and losartan and carvedilol and statins is lame and very minimally effective. Yeah, it's funny to us. It's because it has a very small effect on someone's long-term health outcomes. This is the kind of stuff that really produces an outcome that's meaningful. And I think that if even if you're listening and you're not following every one of these little things, every one of these things you could find dozens of podcasts and studies and multiple companies making products for this because this is the future if people are going to be healthy. And sadly, it's just very, very expensive. But hopefully that will change as we continue going forward. I wanted to ask you sort of about some specific interventions. So you mentioned you're doing a lot of this toxicity testing, and
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, what kind of interventions do you use? So when you find someone who's overloaded with a certain heavy metal, or you see their mitochondrial dysfunction, you mentioned a couple things briefly, but maybe you can go over, and you don't have to go in detail. That's what they have to pay you for to work with you, but just like a brief overview of like different interventions that you use in your practice.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start with, we can start with, let's start with chelation therapy.
Hmm.
I think that chelation therapy, typically the chelating agent we use most commonly is something called EDTA. And EDTA is a binder of lots of different toxins, particularly metals like lead. And if I were to look at heart disease and the things that we don't assess with respect to the underlying root cause of the disease, we're so focused on treating a cholesterol that we miss things like mercury, lead, cadmium, arsenic toxicity, which are not uncommon. And if you go to look for those things, particularly mercury and people who have a lot of metal amalgams in their mouth, mercury is a real issue with respect to, lots of different issues, but from a heart disease perspective, mercury is a real issue. Lead toxicity is a major issue because lead is stored in the bone. And so people who were born and lived in the 70s before we kind of outlawed the leaded gases again, the fuel, and lead in the paints, they have had exposure to lead, and that lead can build up in the system and build up in the bones and stored in fat, and people can have issues with it. They can have lots of mitochondrial issues, lots of oxidative stress issues. And so if you never look for those things, you will never address the root problem. And so chelation therapy is a great way to deal with some of the metals issues. The things that I think most recently that I've gotten involved with that are absolutely mind-blowing, that I think we've totally forgotten about, or not even forgotten about. They've never really come to the forefront, definitely in traditional medicine. But we all know that the cell membrane is an integral part of every cell functioning normally, right? And our cell membranes are made of this lipid bilayer, and they are made of something called phospholipids, right? And as we get older, when we're born, most of our cell membranes, they have something called phosphatidylcholine, which makes up 50 to 60% of the cell membrane. And as we get older, this phosphatidylcholine levels go way down to the 10% range or so. And you start to get a lot more of these phospholipids that are more saturated in your cell membrane fluidity, how well things can get in and out of the cell. It's compromised, right? So if we can improve the cellular function, cell membrane function, then we improve overall cell function, particularly mitochondrial membrane function. And so I use a lot of phospholipid therapy in my patients as well. And it's not just, and when we talk about, but there's lots of papers written on lipid membrane replacement therapy, which will improve mitochondrial function, which will address lots of fatigue illnesses like chronic fatigue syndrome, lots of neurocognitive issues like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. So I think and even me right now, I'm still kind of on the learning curve for using phospholipids, because phosphatidylcholine is only one phospholipid. It's phosphatidylethanolamine and phosphatidylinositol and something called cardiolipin.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really on the learning curve with normalizing cell membrane function. And that's something else that we can measure. We can measure these levels of some of the testing that I'm doing. We can measure membrane potential that improves when we normalize the phospholipid in the membrane. So, and then the third thing that I think really is the new and upcoming kid on the block is something called extracorporeal blood oxygenation and ozonation, EBO2. What I see with my patients in cleaning out the toxins and normalizing mitochondrial function with EBO2 is absolutely incredible. You can't even, I can't even, the work that I'm doing and finding the problems and showing people how you can fix it. And all I have to do is show case after case. I mean, really, it makes my practice very easy because I don't have to prove anything. I'm just going to show you cases of this is what happens, this is what was going on with the patient, and this is how we got rid of these toxins. And EBO2 has been an incredible part of kind of cleaning out the system, so to speak. Okay. What I think we still have left to learn about the EBO2 is just theoretically, right? We're measuring the toxins. The test that I use is measuring toxins in the white blood cells. So what we're seeing is we can clean the toxins out of the white blood cell, but after a few treatments of EBO2, I can't imagine that we've now emptied the body burden and the bones and fat of the toxins. So I suspect, and right, and this is kind of a work in progress in some of the stuff that I'm doing right now. I suspect that these toxins will reaccumulate in the white blood cells over some time period. But my plan is to figure out, okay, how often do we need to use processes like the phospholipids and the EBO2 to keep these toxins out of the cells and continue to get them out of the body? So that's just something that, I mean, I know that we can't get all of the toxins out by just doing a few of these. It just doesn't make sense, right? Theoretically, how do I get it all this? How do I do an hour treatment of EBO2 and get the toxins out of the bone? Yeah, probably didn't happen.
Yeah.
But we are getting it out of the white blood cells. And the key is now, how often do I need this to get these toxins, keep these toxins out? And more importantly, is there a consistent or persistent exposure to these toxins that I need to be avoiding as well?
Fascinating. Your patients are so lucky, Doc. That's like, I mean, this is what we're supposed to be doing, figuring out how to really help people. Thank
Yeah.
you for sharing that. I'm over here taking notes.
And honestly, you can tell my passion. I'm having a lot of fun right now. This is the most fun I've had in my career because I get to figure it out. I get to figure stuff out, and as you figure it out, it becomes incredibly rewarding as you start to figure it out.
And it just makes sense, right? It makes a lot more sense than being told what to do. And I don't know. That's what you got for 12 or 14 years, right? You were just told what to do, and now you're figuring it out. I love that. Um, Another thing I wanted to ask you, similar question. So when it comes to the emotional component of all this stuff, you mentioned some breath work. I am a big proponent of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. That is something that I have a passion for. I have in my clinic ketamine assisted psychotherapy, which we have case after case of amazing results for very specific issues like depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. Specifically, that's what I found. It's like very, very effective for.
Mm-hmm.
What are strategies that you guys, and you can speak to the psychedelic part of it or just generally what you're doing, But this podcast series, this recent season I'm doing, is sort of exploring the mind body spirit connection.
Hmm.
I got kind of sick of talking about nutrition. That's why we're not really going to talk about it, because everyone knows what I think, and we're probably very like-minded. We get it. A lot of people talking about that these days. But from a spiritual standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, what are you doing? What have you seen effective? Sort of where is your head at with that part of things?
Yeah, very, very, very great question. I mean, and truthfully, that mind body connection is what mind body spirit connection, should I say, is what I was talking about us connecting with our patients as well. And I think that is extremely important. Now, I've not done a lot of work in the psychedelic world, but I'm really interested in it. In fact, I was just at a meeting a couple weeks ago, and one of the shareholders at Rhythmia in Costa Rica
Mm-hmm.
was there, and she invited me to come down as a guest to speak there. And I'm really interested to go there. I've never done ayahuasca, but I do think that I want to experience it because I am really tied into the whole metaphysical part of our being. It's been shunned, and we're not supposed to talk about it, right? And the end of the day, that is just as important from a health and wellness and who we are and how we can become the person that, I mean, all that we can be. You have to tap into those abilities, right? So how have I done that, and thus far, and how do I help my patients do that? I use a lot of neurofeedback technology. I use a device called an IASIS, which is actually, we have EEG leads on, and it's a microcurrent device where we can kind of, hate to say it, but we can reprogram stuck pathways. So people who have PTSD and depression and anxiety, we can use a lot of these neurofeedback technologies to help with that. I also am a big believer in just sound, light, vibration in general, right? Vibration energy is information. And so I actually use a device called a neurovisor. That's my latest thing. So I've used BrainTap. I love BrainTap. BrainTap is binaural beats, and you're listening to binaural beats. And I do this every morning as far as, getting me motivated. And the thing, I listen to one called Unending Drive and Motivation. I listen to it every single morning. And that I think powers me to kind of do other things and have the excitement about the things that I do. But most recently, I got into this thing called the neurovisor, which is light and sound together, and it's pretty powerful. Like, I've had to back away and it's kind of a reprogramming and bringing the right and left side of the left hemispheres together. And that is a very powerful technology. I'm not even going to use that with my patients yet, because like, even me, like, I've had to rip the thing off a couple of times because I felt like it was taking me to somewhere. It was a little different. so
Yeah.
so I'm not using that with patients right now. I'm kind of, a lot of the stuff that I do, I experiment on myself first. I understand the science of it, so I'm going to work with it and kind of see what happens. But that one you have to be very careful with neurovisor. That's just my personal experience right now with that. Other stuff from a again, emotion code counseling. I have a therapist that I work with emotion code, cranial sacral therapy, moving the fluid through our spinal canal. Cranial sacral therapy, I'm a big believer in as well. And again, now, I don't do this stuff myself,
Right.
but I have practitioners that I've aligned myself with that are kind of part of, I have an energy medicine kind of a secondary practice part that I've aligned myself with, that I will send my patients to and say, hey, this is also just as important to your health, and I need you to go here because of XYZ. Okay. And so I think the hard part if people are not, and this is my approach to doing that, I show them all of these fancy tests and things that I do, so that they realize that, okay, this guy knows how he's talking about. But then I go into that metaphysical mind, body, spirit thing, and I say, and this is just as important. So they realize that, okay, he's not if you start just talking about that from the start, they're going to be like, oh, this guy's weird. Okay. But what I do is I always talk about all the other micronutrients and all the testing that I've told you guys about and all other stuff. And then I move them into that other space of talking about the metaphysical stuff.
Yeah, and it's important for people to remember it's not this or that. We're not just
Yeah,
doing. Yeah, it's both.
it's both.
It's
Absolutely.
both. I'm gonna steal your energy medicine term.
Okay.
I really like that, because I think that really speaks to what, the physical medicine, like your acupuncturist or your somatic therapist. your sound healing experiences.
Yeah.
A lot of this is just energy work, and in my first few episodes of this series, I talked about energy being a real thing. Just because we can't measure it, or at least
Mhm.
I don't know a way to measure it, it's very
Well,
palpable. Maybe you do.
you can measure it. Okay. There is a device called a squid device, quantum interference device, something quantum interference device, squids. So heart math talks about this a lot. If you look at the heart math data and look at measuring energetic fields, the electromagnetic field around an individual, you can measure I mean, when somebody walks in a room, you can tell if their energy is high or low, right? You can measure the energy of the bio. I won't say energy. You can measure the biomagnetic field or electromagnetic field around a person. And when somebody is really living or living in love and gratitude and appreciation, some of the things that I talk about in some of my talks, the the electromagnetic field is about 5,000 times of when you're angry or sad, those type of things, and it can be measured. So we know I mean, that's a real entity, no question about it. It can be measured.
Yeah, and I think because it starts going into the spiritual components, and we're really divorced from spirituality. Like everything
Mhm.
in our training, all those years of training, I know they didn't talk about spirituality ever. Even in my hospice work and my hospice training, spirituality is a word. It's not a practice, if that makes sense. Like it's, hey, we
Mhm.
have a spiritual counselor, and that's about as far as it goes. And usually that's just religion, and religion is just one path towards spirituality. There's many paths towards spirituality, and that should
Absolutely.
be mentioned. And I think uh, I think to kind of speak to what you mentioned, like I use ketamine assisted psychotherapy because that's a legal, evidence based, and sort of acceptable treatment. But
Mhm.
but we're looking at in the next few years the legalization of MDMA, which not
Mhm.
necessarily a psychedelic, but a substance that's shown great efficacy, especially for PTSD. But there's many other plant substances that are
Mhm.
very effective. Even scary stuff like people think, oh, LSD, that's scary. There's a
Mhm.
lot of research using LSD to help people deal with their emotional and
Yeah.
spiritual trauma. And then you mentioned ayahuasca. I've never spoken about it, and I think I want to say something about that. There is an amazing study from 2021 in the Journal of Psychiatric something or other. It's easily found online, and it talks about an observational study looking at the Shipibo ayahuasca ceremony tradition, and that's probably the largest sort of uh, Amazonian tribe organization, for lack of a better word, culture that has sort of spread throughout the Western world. And the evidence was overwhelming that for long-term wellness, for mental health, that practicing and sitting in ceremony is very, very beneficial. I think
Mhm.
that, you know, we have vilified drugs, we have separated them from the ceremony and from the tradition. And that's really, really sad because it all goes together. It's not about taking a drug, crossing your fingers, it's going to make you feel better. When I talk
Mhm.
about ketamine, I always say it has to be paired with therapy. And that's like a bond between the patient and the therapist. Um, Sitting in ceremony is a bond between the altar, the facilitators, the people guiding you. The music is a critical part of it. You were talking about sound and light. Of course, using light and sound to help connect with the spirit and help control your emotions. It's a critical part of it. It's not necessarily the substance. The substance, whichever substance, ibogaine, whatever. There's so many of them, right? They're a lubricant, is how I like to think. They create an openness to the flow, but then really tapping into energy, tapping into the spirit world is all about your set and setting. It's the environment, it's the people around you. And so I hope that, as you and others like you promote and grow this sort of understanding your mitochondrial health and metabolic health and testing for it and doing the things to excrete the toxins and get rid of the garbage from our lives. I think others are doing amazing work to bring spirituality back into healthcare and show people that drugs are not a scary thing. And when I say drugs, I mean these illegal drugs. All these substances we just mentioned, for the most part, were part of the drug war, vilified and scared. Even ketamine, which was never made illegal, is like a class 3 drug, and
Mhm.
they made up this thing called the K-hole, and people were scared of it for decades. And now that we have a terrible mental health epidemic, people are opening up, and you have the VA doing studies on these drugs, and thank God for that. So, I think that's also kind of the future is bringing spirituality back into medicine.
Yeah.
I hope to
You
be
know,
part of that.
if it means anything, I mean, that was great. I mean, I agree with you 100%. If it means anything to you, there is hope because I had to renew my license this year, and I had to do CMEs, and I signed up. There's this consortium that has all the CMEs, and you can choose which ones you want to do. And they actually had classes on psychedelic assisted therapies. And I was amazed. I actually did that one that had a lot of the agents that you talked about. And this is a traditional medicine, renew my license thing. And they had an acupuncture one too. So, I mean, I was super surprised that that was even there. But they were. So I think that um, we may have a little opening and things there's hope. There's hope, should I say. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to say is where you were something else that it was super important. What was it about? Oh gosh. Well, I'll move on. I've forgotten what it was. I'll think about it in a second. Something else that I wanted to say about one of the other things you just said. Oh, mitochondria. Let's talk
Mm,
about one more thing. Here's the coolest thing ever. Okay. So I'm always trying to be objective about everything that I do. I love trying to make the science objective so I can explain it to people. But obviously, the metaphysical is very hard, and explaining quantum biology and quantum physics and wave particle duality is how do you explain that, right?
mhm.
It's hard to explain, right? However, in thinking through this one day, we talk about Bruce Lipton has a book called The Biology of Belief.
Good one.
And that book, if you haven't read it, have you read Biology of Belief?
It's on my desk.
Yeah, you need to read Biology of Belief because he brings a lot of the science to the metaphysical. And the cell membrane is at the heart of all of this. And particularly the mitochondrial membrane is at the heart of all of this. And so in reading that book, it dawned on me, I said, I think that the mitochondrial membrane may be our connection to the universe, God, the ether, the field, whatever you want to call it. So I just started Googling, right? And so lo and behold, I mean, there's papers out there about the quantum mitochondria and mitochondrial quantum tunneling that happens in the mitochondria. It has been described 100%. And so when I think about mitochondrial health and mitochondria producing energy and energy medicine, there is a really, really potential story that we're kind of painting here about the mitochondria and being our connection to whatever you want to call it, right? I call it God. I mean, he's guided everything that I've done and continues to do so. I truly believe that the mitochondria are more than just producing ATP as energy. It just doesn't happen that that's what we call our energy or our batteries. The mitochondria has more to do with energy than we think that it does.
I love it. I suspect you're right. I suspect the two things that we just described are probably more interconnected than we ever thought. Wow, what a fun conversation, Dr. Davis. Wow, I don't know. I hope everyone loved it as much as I did because I'm over here giddy and very, very educated, and I have 100 things to look up. I think that's our time. I want to thank you so much for sharing your passion, all of this information, and kind of just scratching the surface, obviously, of what you know and what you can do for people, and what amazing work you're doing. And thank you for that. For all those listening, how could they reach you? How could they learn more about what you're doing? Social media, website, anything like that?
Yeah, if you can find me, I'm at Liquivida. I'm the chief medical officer of Liquivida. And I'm also, my private practice in Sarasota, Florida is called Reveal Vitality. And so you can find me at Reveal Vitality. Look my website up and you can contact me there. The most fun part, we'll talk about this next time. I have I have a fitness and longevity center going up that we are building out. It'll be done in about 3 months where we have hyperbarics and red light therapy and cryotherapy and lots of training devices like Vasper and ARX and Carol bikes. So I'm really putting my passions together now in the fitness world and doing a lot of cool stuff to really improve longevity.
I love it. So, with that, thank you, Doc. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And until next time, goodbye.